So at the last one of these, I presented some practice work in preparation for an exhibition that was opening in the Ireland, the West Cork Arts Centre, which then toured to Wexford Arts Centre in Drogheda, and that just completed in February. And I've been actually trying to pull back from what people call art and take a step away, really. So I'm going to, like many of us, read the text, and the risk is that sounds robotic, and it's kind of ironic that we're at a digital event and we're all reading from bits of paper. Not all of us. I think Robin used your mobile device, and you had some people have screens and so on. But and hopefully, if I read it quickly, there'll be some mistakes, and that'll make it seem more authentic. So what is artificial stupidity? The subject here arose out of research completed in 2016, which began a few years before in 2012, whilst I was on a no-budget residency in a literally almost underground artist-run space. And the work was carried out during the residency on I was using a 1K Sinclair ZX81 computer, so a kind of stupid machine, 30 years old. And it was a response to the attention being given at that time to World War II, or should I say the emergency, codebreaker Alan Turing. So the famous logician who, following in the footsteps of Ada Lovelace, UCC's own George Boole, and John Venn, the inventor of the Venn diagram, because he, Turing that is, had broken another set of codes, the oppressive moral ones of that time, to do with sexual orientation, was sentenced to be chemically castrated. The process, many argue, but it is not proven, resulted in his suicide at the age of 41 in 1954. Turing would, in 2013, be pardoned posthumously through royal prerogative by David Cameron, who was in the habit then, in the years before Brexit, of apologising for past actions of the British state. So without going into all the detail, the use of the phrase artificial stupidity was a reflection on my probably unfounded frustration and dissatisfaction with artists in particular, seemingly getting on the Turing bandwagon. To do justice to his legacy would surely require drawing up knowledge relating to that history of logic and coding, and also to political knowledge, rather than only connecting with it via art collaborations. So rather than repeat what's in the abstract for this event, the intention with a book currently in process is to represent findings from that research, that PhD, and to bring the arguments up to date. Also, the seemingly disparate uses of a term, which was initially a kind of joke, artificial stupidity, can be linked together, to my mind, in unexpected ways. Already, the background story about Alan Turing highlights the potential for analogizing between the codes, instructions, methods, procedures, programs, applications, and routines, the language of software development, still at play within complex AI systems, and other codes which have historically had direct bearing on human behavior. You think of the law, conventions, etiquette, scripture even, and morality, ethics, and bureaucratic systems and processes which preempted computing and extend beyond it. And I've got sort of 4 questions built into this piece of writing, provocations as well. But an underlying pervading question for me, in fact, is can an app be compared to a bureaucratic procedure? And if so, there are important implications. Also, a second question, if it's considered important to engage thoughtfully with the numerous emerging forms of AI and to be wary of the algorithm, as many AI insiders warn we should, then a critical attitude ought to be adopted too, surely, with respect to the expanded formulations and what constitutes an algorithmic system. So I'm going to park those 2 questions, really, and maybe you can help me consider them, either after this event or soon. As an aside, I think it's interesting, and this might be considered a research methodology of sorts, to reflect on terms, firstly in their necessarily limited, typical, traditional ways of being used, and also to think about their expanded meaning. So just one way of doing the latter is to investigate the etymology. Artificial is from the Latin artificialis, which meant to make or contrive something by art, and from the French artificiel for skillfully made, but interestingly also relating to cunning, seeking to deceive, being affected. So the word artificial could be associated with acting, or pretentiousness, or inverse pretentiousness. The expression artificial stupidity and close variations of it is in much more widespread use now, in fact, than when I finished that practice-led PhD. James Bridle, Meredith Broussard, Stephen Pinker, Hito Steyerl have employed the term, and one scientific paper even abbreviates it to AS. So I'd like to consider some of the different interpretations of the phrase, and this diagram behind, which contains lots of detail, but the 5 blue circles really, for me, are 5 different possible uses of that term. The oldest literal application I found was in an Economist editorial from the early 1990s, and it was used then to warn against what they saw as an error in the approach. The argument, and it still is a valid one, was that attempts to create artificial intelligences which literally mimicked human behavior or appeared human were less interesting than what used to be called good old-fashioned AI, GoFi. So I think it's interesting to the most obvious use of the term is with respect to technology itself, obviously, and to technique as well, specifically software systems and AI tools. And secondly, counterintuitively, there are reasons one might want to deliberately build in, or the corporations might want to build in faults, in gaming, for example, and so on, to create a sense of authenticity. As soon as people began programming computers, the word bug, which is an old-fashioned term now, emerged. It is the case that you can't create a perfect program, nor a perfect application, nor a 100% robust, all-encapsulating bureaucratic procedure. There's nothing new in any of this, but the fundamental level, at a fundamental level, the same is true of contemporary systems. In fact, even though the core of any piece of software is often short, neat, elegant, vast swathes of code are necessary to deal with the exceptions, the protections, and situations that rarely arise. So something like the Richardson effect may be at play. Meteorologist Lewis Fry Richardson discovered that the more accurately you try to measure something, the more complex it becomes. A corollary seems to be the paradox that the more precisely the intentions of a coded system, or for a coded system, the more complex it becomes. So whilst decreasing risk by adding lines of code, one also increases risk. At a basic level, this might be the risk of a division by zero, or that nested loops iterate infinitely. The trade-off between quantity and attempted rigor is illustrated by an air traffic control emergency in which a particular glitch was buried in 1 of 4 million lines of code. So the process of resolving and perfecting the code is itself iterative, often nowadays, involving crowd-oriented approaches, the release of beta versions, but that only works for where there's a mass user base, really. A term like intelligence may be used, but what is also common is human disdain for systems, processes, bureaucracies, and apps. Complaining, The late David Graeber gave attention to the reassuring inadequacy of attempts to create flawless, comprehensive systems in his 2015 book, The Utopia of Rules, on Technology, Stupidity, and the Secret Joys of Bureaucracy. So poor design is common, workarounds are quickly invented, systems are hacked, and stories are shared. The impact may simply be amusing or result in something frightening. The problem may be trivial or catastrophic. And some examples from a recent book by Mustafa Suleyman, who was the co-founder and head of applied AI at DeepMind. He gives the example. 1961, for example, a B-52 in the skies over North Carolina developed a fuel leak. The crew ejected from the ailing aircraft, leaving it and its payload to plummet to the ground into a field. One of its 4 safety mechanisms, just one was left in place, and an explosion was miraculously avoided. Tiny hardware malfunctions can produce outside risks. In 1980, a single faulty computer chip costing 46 cents almost triggered a major nuclear incident over the Pacific. And Sarah just gave the example of the sub-postmasters issue in Britain, which is very interesting to look into. In his initial book on an introduction to AI, Blay Whitby describes a potentially disastrous scenario when military specialists were training a neural net to recognize pictures containing tanks. So problems in some ways are not new, and the issue is not just to do with accidents. Imaginary robot, whilst kind of gurus and philosophers, people like us, speculate about the future of AI and imaginary robot Armageddons, the singularity, it is clear that one-sided, methodical, tech-driven annihilation has been a common thing. Whether one chooses to see faults and slips as Freudian or not, built-in bias, and thank you for kind of bringing up the subject. Built-in bias is a much talked about subject. Robin Palmer, in the book that was produced last year by UCC and Sample Studios, points out that there's a whole load of scholarship on this subject and the subject of built-in bias. So, yeah, what did you say exactly? Artificial intelligence. Let's see here. Yeah, I must have taken out the actual quote, but it's a good one. It refers exactly to this subject. Yeah, what you said was extensive scholarship already exists on the question of systematic bias. So artificial intelligence is kind of a widely used term as well. One incident widely reported upon in a broadsheet news headline, artificial intelligence fails to beat real stupidity, involved a Twitter chatbot which had quickly learned to become misogynist and racist, and many of you will have heard about that. Examples like that are one reason why large language models are now trained, contrary to many people's understanding of how they work actually, prior to being released onto the world. Specialists, engineers and researchers specifically working at OpenAI and similar companies, they're the ones who select the data and the readings and learning that are fed to the learning algorithms. So seemingly ChatGPT and the other tools are trained to be kind of reasonably intelligent, good liberals, centrists, etc., etc. Bias has to also include palpable social media and algorithmically driven policing, namely the privileging and demoting of certain posts and status updates online, with users being sanctioned and barred from popular platforms. James Bridle describes a Turing-complete programming language which does not have its basis in the ASCII character set, which encodes by default Latin characters and is based on the English language. Ramsey Nasser created CALB, based instead on Arabic principles, to demonstrate how altering the language of code can also change its nature. So, in terms of this diagram, I've basically spent almost all the time so far on the first one or two of these blue circles, but I'd just like to quickly touch upon some of the others and also to wonder about other conclusions that might emerge in this piece of writing. Sadie Plant, in her 1990s Zeros and Ones book, noted Ada Lovelace, and I'm guessing that many of you know who we're talking about, her frustration in the 19th century at others' inability to think forwards to the potential for machine intelligence. Her collaborator Charles Babbage, like Skibbereen's Percy Ludgate a few decades later, was practically building calculating engines. Ludgate's worked, Babbage's never did in his lifetime, but Lovelace was able to do something else. She was able to philosophize. She demonstrated astonishing foresight and imagination when very few would have seen the potential for machine thinking or machine intelligence or creativity for that matter. And that widespread ignorance, which stretched right up to Turing's time, was something that Sadie Plant describes as artificial stupidity. Two other ways in which the term has been used appear unconnected with the three that I've kind of mentioned so far. One is to describe the many examples in history and presently, perhaps, of how one human group might deem another group or individual to be intellectually inferior. Micheál Ronell, in her tome on the subject of stupidity, pointed out how IQ testing was used to artificially designate certain demographics and sections of the population inadequate. During the heyday of eugenics, many women who failed the culturally constructed IQ tests were non-consensually sterilized in California and elsewhere in the United States. Ronell in turn cites Stephen Jay Gould, his book, The Mismeasure of Man, which is an important critique of biological determinism. What does it actually mean to call another person stupid? Clearly, the term has more to do with kinds of contempt, either personal or based on racial categories, nationality, gender, region, and social class, than anything scientific. So it's a controversial term for good reasons. It serves no other purpose when applied to humans than to insult or to denigrate. The other is stupid, according to Ronell, and we can look at the histories relating to the depiction of women and say Irish people historically in British publications like Punch in the 19th century, especially when these groups began to act forcibly against oppression, poverty, and discrimination. So an obscure point to make as well, and one I'd like to investigate in the text, in the writing, is could the propensity, and this is my third question, for the propensity to be tribal, to find scapegoats, to collude against others when it's irrational to do so, that is, be something which is directed instead against the machinic world. In other words, could technology of the softer, heavier varieties, including bureaucracies and systems, be treated always as something fundamentally stupid? After all, the definition stupid relates also to inert matter. A child who has had a bump on it, may call the table stupid. This is not to dismiss the human overlapping with technological infrastructures, often stressed by thinker Joanna Zielinska, but could we also distinguish ourselves and look down upon technologies as our resources rather than hailing them or fearing them? So that's another question that I want to park. So returning to the idea of performance, artificial stupidity I also employ to describe human behavior, the ability to act foolish, to play the intellectual or other kind of underdog, actually, for perhaps dubious reasons, but also necessary at times, and for productive reasons, as a means of creative unearthing, for example. And this last use was the primary subject of my practice-led PhD, which I'll not be kind of giving much attention in this book. Creativity, by definition, requires an escape from what's known. It requires unknowing, unlearning, and it's perhaps no surprise that historically artists have exploited means of dipping into unconscious or seemingly foolish behavior or modes of operation in order to make breakthroughs. As we're probing into the problematic term stupidity, then obviously we should ask the question, what exactly is intelligence? The word is widely used, but can it be defined at all? And where is agency and intelligence located? Donna Haraway and the late Bruno Latour, extended the possibility to networks of animals, machines, and things. Karen Barad, following 20th century physicist Niels Bohr, writes of agential realism, which infers reality and intelligence based on action, on doing. So these more contemporary thinkers owe something to the mid-20th century field of cybernetics, which was brought up already, and which was a kind of anti-science science, actually, according to Andrew Pickering, a philosophy of feedback loops, and one that does not need to explain what is inside the black box. So cybernetics' origins ominously emerged out of attempts at missile guidance and control systems engineering. It was then adopted by alternative psychiatrists, management consultants, artists, writers, and musicians like William Burroughs and Brian Eno. And prior to cybernetics, other modes of thought, Eastern philosophies in particular, covered similar ground. So systems can be thought of as intelligent. A more famous outcome of cybernetics and systems thinking was, once again, James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, contained in a book he wrote whilst holed up in Adrigole on the Beara Peninsula in West Cork. In fact, Lovelock theorized and more or less claimed that Mother Earth was a self-regulating, intelligent, almost conscious system. That was before he became disillusioned with how things really unfolded. So unsurprisingly, in all these conceptions being listed, and this is another provocation, human exceptionalism, the privileging of our capacities over other agents in the network is a big no-no. Would it be interesting, though, to push back against the distributed network type idealism? And I'm about to finish, but these theories often, they're presented themselves in the shape of fixations on natural phenomena in recent years, the secret or hidden life of trees, the question of, in recent years, mushrooms, fungi, and so on. Natalie Cessier and Samuel Solomon have just published a paper exposing what they call the mycological turn and questioning how fungi are now being marshalled to address ecological and capitalist crisis. Caroline Bassett pointed out in the cybernetics, in one of her books, that cybernetics was never as hygienic as its adherents thought it could be. Even Donna Haraway was and is not advocating for a complete blurring of all the boundaries. We are responsible for the boundaries, she said in her old Cyborg Manifesto book. So would a highly critical, perhaps, revisiting of human exceptionalism be sensible, informed informed by this turn towards network theories? And that's the fourth question I want to leave dangling, and that's all I've got to say, really.